Okay? So I want to start by sharing just a couple of introductory words about what I hope to do together in this series. First, I hope it goes without saying that I will not be solving the mysteries of the Akedah, nor will I be listening to myself saying things 6 times. I find it hard enough to listen to myself once, 3 times as much. And I don't purport to be offering any definitive reading of the Akedah. Instead, what we're going to do over these 4 sessions is really hold this chapter, Genesis 22, Breshit Chaf-Bet, up to the light in a variety of ways. We'll begin tonight by doing some, for lack of a less pretentious way of putting it, literary probings of Genesis 22, of what's going on in that chapter and what we might learn from some of the literary ambiguity of this chapter. And I hope we'll also spend some time looking at a few select passages from rabbinic midrash that I think bring out or accentuate certain important points in the text. Then, either later tonight or next time, we will spend time looking at the relationship between Genesis 1 and Genesis 21 and Genesis 22, or put in the language of the Israeli scholar Uriel Simon, the relationship between what he calls Akedat Yishmael and Akedat Yitzchak. And we're going to see what the meaning of those 2 texts right together are. And then I hope to spend some time looking at biblical and rabbinic, through some subtle readings, biblical and rabbinic perspectives on the consequences of the Akedah for Isaac and Sarah. What it means for them and how the Bible itself and the rabbis cope with the obviously enormous damage that both of them sustain as a result of this religious act on Abraham's part. Then in the last 2 sessions, we're going to shift gears kind of dramatically and look at the modern afterlife of this text. By which I mean, I want to look at the life that Genesis 22 takes on in 20th century Jewish thought. We'll begin by talking a little bit about Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish existentialist thinker, who really sets the terms of the conversations about the Akedah in his book Fear and Trembling. And then we'll look at a series of modern Jewish thinkers together. And maybe I'll telegraph where we're going with that by making a sort of simplistic, but I think still helpful point about this. As a rule, I think you can say that in the 20th century, Jews who think about the Akedah are divided between those who think that the central lesson of the Akedah is contained in the verse, Kach na et bincha, right? And sacrifice. The people who are most passionately associated with that understanding of the Akedah, that is, that the lesson of the Akedah is the centrality of sacrifice for the religious life, are Joseph Soloveitchik and Yeshayahu Leibovitz. And in a way, at the other end of the spectrum, we have those who say that the lesson and the paradigm of the Akedah is in fact, Al tishlach yadcha el hana'ar. Don't touch that boy, right? And that is most powerfully associated with Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, who insists that that is the pasuk, that is the paradigm of the Akedah. Now you can imagine how thinkers will be led to very different understandings of what this story is meant to do for our religious lives, how it's meant to orient our religious lives, right? Depending on whether they say the essence is the command to sacrifice Isaac, or the essence is the command, don't harm that boy. And I will even sort of put out now that one of the things we may want to be thinking about is what kind of readings of the Akedah would we want that would insist on the centrality and importance of both of those verses simultaneously, as I think on some level the Chumash does, right? Both the command and the command that undermines the command. Is that clear, that language, right? Both the command and then, not the withdrawal of the command, but the command that undermines the command. Okay. So tonight, again, I'd like to begin with some literary and theological probings of this text. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you to take maybe 3 or 4 minutes to just read Genesis 22 And I'm going to ask you to do something that's almost impossible to do. I'm going to ask you to read it with as new and fresh eyes as you possibly can. That is, to the extent that you're capable of this, set aside what you think you know the Akedah is about. Okay? So we're going to spend literally 4 minutes, which actually undermines what I'm saying, because I don't think this text can be read in 4 minutes. I'm not even sure this text can be read in 2 hours. I think this is incredibly carefully, subtly fashioned text. And then, once we've done that, I'm going to open the floor for a couple of opening comments from people about a very simple question. What's the Akedah about? When I call it simple, I'm being playful, right? An incredibly difficult question. And then we'll leave that behind, and we'll start actually working on the Akedah. So let's take 3 to 4 minutes of quiet time to read, and then we'll come and start our work on this text.
Does anyone not have a source sheet? Has anyone not signed it?
I'll do my best. Okay, so we won't have a long discussion about this now, but I want to take a sum total of 5 comments before we get started. What is the Akedah about?
Abraham.
Give me more.
And not Isaac.
It's about Abraham and not Isaac. Okay, we will see the extent to which that is true in the afterlife of this text, whether this text is about Abraham or about Isaac. In the Middle Ages, which we will not spend a lot of time talking about, as Jews look for texts to comfort themselves about the experience of martyrdom, the text is often read as being fundamentally about Isaac. Oftentimes, modern thinkers will emphasize Abraham as the subject of this text, as the one who is asked to make sacrifices. There is an interesting article about Rabbi Soloveitchik's theology that is called Lo Yitzchak hu hakorban ela Avraham, right? Isaac is not the sacrifice, but rather Abraham is, and we'll get a chance to talk about that 4 weeks from now. Yeah, Shoshi.
The tension between Vayelchu Shnehem Yachdav and the Kaf et Limcha.
Okay.
So the tension between them working together toward this goal and Abraham being the active force and Isaac being the passive.
Great. Okay. We will see that the rabbis are really interested in emphasizing Vayelchu Shnehem Yachdav, Ze la'akod v'ze le'aked, as they say. This one to bind and this one to be bound. That is together. We'll explore that a little bit tonight, and then I hope a little bit more next time. Yeah, please.
About Yirat Hashem, fear of God, and subservience to God becoming the basis of God's choosing Abraham and thus the Jewish people.
Great. So we will get a chance to discuss this too. One of the things that should be notable to any careful reader of Breshit is that a very strange progression takes place over the cycle of Abraham's stories, right? It begins with God seemingly making unconditional promises to Abraham, and in a way culminates with Genesis 22, when God repeats those promises, but now says, Ki ya'an asher, because you obeyed me. And we'll see, in fact, the ways in which, or we could see the ways in which there is a tension or a development in Genesis between the notion of covenant as something God enters into as a function of pure grace, and covenant is that which demands not only human action, but incredibly self-sacrificial human action, right? That's this chapter. So this chapter, in a way, seems to change the terms of the covenant that we've seen in earlier chapters in Breshit. Yeah?
Punishing Sarah for sending away Ishmael.
Punishing Sarah for sending away Ishmael. We will come to this. Those of you who were in my Breshit my class on Avraham in the fall know that we spent a lot of time looking at medieval parshanim, medieval commentators who have some really critical things to say about Sarah and to a lesser extent, but also Avraham, and the repercussions that they think that has later on in Jewish history. We may or may not come back to that. We may also talk about this undercurrent in the history of Jewish commentary that says the Akedah is not primarily a nisayon, a test, but is in fact an onesh, a punishment. A punishment for Abraham, a punishment for Sarah. We'll see. One last final thought. Yeah, please.
To beg the question, the two stories together are why we're here. In fact, we'll always be here. So that it's a setup by God for future generations.
The two stories together of
Sarah and Ishmael and Abraham and Isaac, then the anomalies of those stories are forever challenging to the Jewish people, and it's the central opening chapter of the Jewish people's life, and it's a puzzle we'll never unwrap, and that's why we're all here this week.
Great, so let's go home. Okay, so thank you for those kind of just opening little sprinkles into this discussion. And now I'd like to ask you to walk with me through this text a little bit, okay? So, and I will draw your attention, I hope, to some interesting pieces of this text. And you should feel free to stop me with thoughts, reflections, etc., and hopefully we'll be able to engage a little bit in that way. So, Genesis 22 begins with a phrase we are not going to really focus on tonight. Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, and it happened after these things. The rabbis love this opportunity to play with the meaning of dvarim, right? Not meaning these things, but rather these words. And they are intrigued by the question of what conversations it was that led to the Akedah. And perhaps we can get to that another time, but we won't talk about that now. What I actually want to point out about this first verse is for an American who speaks English, or even for a modern Hebrew reader, it's easy to overlook this one interesting textual point. That is that in biblical Hebrew, we might have expected this text to say, Vayinaseh ha'Elohim et Avraham. But rather it says, ha'Elohim nisa et Avraham, right? The subject before the verb is an unusual construction. And I suggest sort of tentatively that that is a way of emphasizing God's absolute transcendence here, God's sovereignty. And God tested Abraham, right? That is an unusual way for the text to speak. And it may even be that the word ha-Elohim is a way of emphasizing that even more. In other words, not Elohim as God's name, but ha-Elohim. The really interesting Christian feminist scholar Phyllis Tribble translates this, I think, as God the God, or God indeed God, right? This way of sort of emphasizing the absolute transcendence of God in this story. Okay, so God steps in here in this transcendent way. That's going to be important to keep in mind because next week we're actually going to read a modern Christian thinker who's going to suggest, perhaps counterintuitively, that the Akedah is a story about God's vulnerability. Okay, so it's going to be important to think about whether this, how much weight to give to this, the Ha-Elohim Nisat Avraham. Okay, now, I'm not talking about Hineni now. We will talk about that when we talk a little bit about Emmanuel Levinas in a couple of weeks. And then, verse 2 is what I want to pick up on first. First, Vayomer, Kachna, and then the tripartite structure, Et bincha, et yichidcha, asher ahavta. What does that immediately call to mind? Or what should it immediately call to mind? Where else do we have this tripartite commandment of God to Abraham? I just said, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladetcha umibeit avicha. Right? Go forth from your land and your house, etc. And then, as if it weren't obvious enough, the pasuk goes on and says, ding, 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 V'lech lecha el eretz haMoriah. Now, I think that what's going on here, as quite a few scholars in the 20th century suggested, is an incredibly interesting intertextual move. And in the Jewish world, Martin Buber was the person who pointed this out most clearly. In the Christian world, a very important Bible scholar named Gerhard von Rad suggested that what's going on here is the text is signaling us that there are these two crucial moments in the life of Abraham. In the first, he is asked to give up his past, and in the second, he is asked to give up his future. Genesis 12 is the moment in which Abraham is told, in order to walk with me, you must give up your past. Genesis 22 is the moment where, even more difficultly, Abraham is told, to walk with me, you must give up your future. Or, perhaps put differently, you must give up what you thought your future held. Now, just for a moment, does anyone want to reflect on why that might be? You're writing a theology of Sefer Breshit. Why this incredibly demanding request of Abraham, or demand of Abraham? Why? It's not enough that he had to leave everything behind, according to Genesis 12, but now he has to give up everything he's prayed for and longed for and been promised and given by God. Why? See, this just shows how difficult this text really is. Please.
He starts clean.
Why does he need to start clean again now? He's an old man.
I'm thinking out of context. In the basic training of the Marine Corps, they strip everything away, and now it leaves people vulnerable for you to now be completely accepting of the new regime.
Okay. Good. I'll take two more thoughts about this, and then we'll sort of keep moving through the text. Danny?
And it's possible it could be to emphasize what God won't ask in the end. That it is while the first was about what God actually will ask, and the second is throwing out an example of what God might have asked, and then at the end, as we know, you could say the pedagogy is aimed at saying, hey, this isn't something.
So when I constructed before the paradigm 1 and paradigm 2 of the 20th century appropriations of this text, Danny has now begun to argue for paradigm 2, right? That is, that the essence of this story is really, no, I'm not asking you that. Okay,
It's
we'll
about
we'll
grace.
keep that open for now. We'll keep that open for now. One more thought about this. Yes, please.
Picking up on the idea of God's transcendence, it's simply presenting God as the ultimate puppet master. I can pull this string, I can pull this string, I can pull that string, and I'll do it at any time, however I like. And you really have nothing to say about it. I mean, I was going to tell you to do this, and I'm going to tell you to do the opposite, and I'm going to tell you to leave, and then I'm going to tell you you're about to die, and you think you've worked all your life for this, and now you're not.
Okay, so it's interesting. So that reading reads the God of this chapter as sort of capricious and willful.
Yes.
Yes. And that's not an insane reading of this chapter. What I think it is a difficult reading to sustain is as a reading of the God of Breshit in general, who seems to have, for one reason or another, which the Torah decides not to tell us, fallen in love with Avraham. Right? I mean, and I use that language quite clearly. God has fallen in love with Avraham and chosen to elect him to enter into special relationship with. And that fact leads many commentators, both traditional and modern, to want to find some lesson God wants Avraham to learn other than mere obedience. Although, maybe that is the lesson. We'll all of this can be about, Vicky, last comment for now.
I just had one thought, which was, if you don't have a past and you don't have a future, what you have is the present. You have the present of Abraham and God together. And that's what the focus then is.
Yeah, I think there is that. I mean, certainly one of the main lessons of Genesis 12 is this dual command that Abraham is given. One, leave everything behind, and two, I'm not telling you now where you're going. That is, walk with me. And the language of the tradition, Avraham is mekabel sachar al kol psiya ufsiya. Avraham is rewarded for every step he takes, not knowing what his destination is, but being present now. Now, by the way, there's one reading of this text, which I have to say I find not persuasive as a reading of the Pshat, but is a very interesting midrash. Phyllis Tribble, who I mentioned a moment ago, suggests that this text is actually about, now this is inflected very much by a late 20th century American context, Avraham learning the lesson of non-attachment. Right? Avraham learning a certain Buddhist lesson from the God of the Hebrew Bible, that is, you cannot go through life with your whole identity fixed on anything, even your family. I teach you non-attachment. Or, the only thing you can be attached to is me. And actually, by the way, Tribble does this really beautiful feminist midrash in which she suggests that the tragedy of Genesis 22 is that Avraham is given the lesson of non-attachment, when in fact it's Sarah who's the one who needs to learn that. Right? Sarah, who's the one who is so ferociously protective of Isaac that she, as was pointed out, right, is cruel to Ishmael and Hagar. So in 21, Tribble says, Hagar learns the lesson of non-attachment. But in 22, Sarah is overlooked, and Avraham learns the lesson of non-attachment. Now, it's a beautiful midrash. If you want the reference for that article, I'm happy to give it to you. I'm not sure that it's a good reading of the Hebrew Bible to talk about its lesson as non-attachment. But we can come back to that. Yes, very last comment on this point.
To the modern sensibility, where is Ishmael if he says, Bincha Yechicha?
Great, perfect. By the way, I did not pay you to do that, but I wanted to point out that because of the very famous Rashi, there's a very famous Rashi based on Breshit Rabbah, where when God says, Kachna et bincha, and Avraham says, I have two, right? Et Yechicha, and he says, oh, I have two that are unique. Actually, that makes us overlook something that I have to confess, it was only as I've been looking at this text sort of obsessively in the last week that I realized that the power of the word Yechicha in this chapter is God is saying to Avraham, for all you know, Ishmael is lost. You sent him away. Yeah, I did say, Al yira beinecha al anar v'al avdecha. Don't worry about him. But you've already lost one son. This is your only son. In other words, it's not a statement that Isaac is your uniquely favored one. It's that Isaac is the only one you have left. Because in the last chapter, I told you to listen to Sarah and send away the first one. So now the one thing you have left, the one son you have left, send him away too. Now, turning to verse 3 for a minute. So here we have Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. Avraham immediately gets up and does what God commands. And something to make an obvious point, one of the sources of the power of this chapter is precisely that it leaves all of the emotional work for the reader to fill in. Right? That is part of the literary artistry of this chapter, is that it actually asks us to do all the work of imagining what is Abraham feeling, what is Isaac feeling, or as one scholar puts it, right, if you want to do a creative writing assignment for any graduate student in writing, have them imagine the dialogue between Abraham and Isaac during those 3 days, right? Which the Torah makes a conscious decision to be totally silent about. So what we're given, amazingly, in Genesis 3 is Abraham getting up in the morning and starting to do it. What is Abraham thinking? I don't know. What is Abraham feeling? I don't know. Right? The text puts a tremendous burden on the reader to fill in. What am I feeling? Am I feeling piety, revulsion, ambivalence? What? And if I'm feeling that, what is Abraham feeling in this text? Okay, now, literarily, I just want to point out something that's not obvious. The text does this interesting thing. Verse 3 has 6 verbs in it, 6 verbs of Abraham's actions, 3 verbs of Abraham's action, then the center, Yitzchak Beno, and 3 more verbs of Abraham's action. So Abraham in this verse is the actor, and Isaac, his son, is the acted upon, and we are left to fill in the emotional content of what it means to be acting in this way upon not just Isaac, but Isaac, his son, Yitzchak Beno. And lest you think that I'm sort of making a mountain out of a molehill, if you look at verses 9 and 10, you will see that again, after the initial verb of vayavo'u, which Abraham and Isaac do together, we again find in verses 9 and 10 6 verbs, 3 start, Yitzchak Beno, 3 verbs again. That is, Abraham is acting upon Isaac, his son, and the verbs he is acting out threaten impending doom and peril for Yitzchak Beno. And again, we have this challenge of figuring out what to make emotively, not to mention theologically, of what Abraham is doing here. Now, one final note about this verse, and here I'm indebted to Robert Alter, who I think makes this really kind of stunning point, that the verb vayivaka atzei olah, and Abraham chopped wood, is actually meant to add to the eerie effect of what's happening in this chapter. Because if you're not yet horrified and terrified of what's going on, I am cutting things up with an axe. They are splintering. They are broken apart. In case you wanted to read a nice little story, the text comes along and says, no, something awful is about to happen. Vayivaka atzei olah, as a kind of precursor for what's about to take place and unfold between Abraham, Isaac, and God. Now, skipping for a minute to verse 5, I wanted to point out to you, and I'm curious, actually I'll take a couple comments after I say this about what people think about this, but several literary readers of the Bible have suggested that when Abraham says to his servant boys, Hane'arim, you stay here, va'ani v'hana'ar nelcha ad ko, and the lad and I will go ad ko, which we will spend a lot of time on in a little while, talking about what those words mean. That in fact, that's a moment of Abraham trying emotionally to distance himself from Isaac. That is, and let's put it more forcefully, the narrator has Abraham use the same word to describe Isaac as the narrator used to describe the two servants, right? They are Ne'arim, and this is also a Nar. Now, if that's right, it's interesting that in verse 6, it immediately goes back to the no. So it's almost like, if you want to read verse 5 as Abraham trying to distance himself, verse 6 points out that he can't pull it off. Right? That he doesn't manage to do that. Now I have to say, I'm not totally persuaded by this reading, because it's also the case that in Genesis 21 and 22, when the angel of God appears, he also refers to both boys as Hanar, which strikes me potentially as a term of affection rather than distancing. But other people want to read it as, actually, instead of well, what do people think about that? Any thoughts about that? People find that convincing, unconvincing? Yeah.
Well, Rivka, when she's helping Jacob trick Esau, keeps on referring to Esau as Isaac's son and not her own son. So there's some kind of distance happening there, except when she puts Esau's clothing onto Jacob, then it says her son. When there's some, like, she tries to distance, but as soon as she goes into his dirty laundry, all of a sudden it's his son again. So there's some kind of parallel there.
Okay, interesting. I mean, you could develop this point a little further if you wanted to by suggesting that aniva hana'ar is distancing, but nelcha is a verb that goes together. And then vayelchu shnehem yachdav is again, shnehem is separation, and yachdav is togetherness. I mean, you make of that what you will, but that's kind of another possibility, that the text is playing between detachment and attachment, between connection and disconnection. Okay, so we'll push forward a little bit here. Now, I think that the first moment, in a way, that is theologically super challenging is when in verse 5, Abraham says, "V'nishtachaveh v'nashuva aleichem," and we will worship, and we will come back to you. So the question is Abraham lying? Is he keeping the truth from himself because it's too painful to bear? Is he expressing faith that in the end it will not turn out, in a way that's anticipating Danny's comment, that it will not turn out the way it appears now that it's going to turn out? Or, as I actually would suggest in addition to all this, is Abraham beginning to do what I think he's going to do a little bit later, which is to turn the test on God? To say, oh, we'll be back. Don't turn me into a liar, God. Now, I don't know. Those are all possibilities. He's lying because if he tells the truth, the Na'arim will jump on him and stop him. He's not able to confront the truth, right? Those are all possibilities. Or he has faith. After all, Sarah had a child after it was biologically impossible for her to have a child. That is, he learned in Kierkegaard's language that with this God, all things are possible. So he can be going with the assumption that he's going to fulfill God's will, and the faith, confidence, hope that God's will not involve doing what it seems now that it will require him to do. Or he's saying, God, he's coming back, right? I leave that for now as this incredible, I think, powerful ambiguity in this text. Now, if you turn to verse 6, there's a kind of interesting image here. Abraham takes the wood for the burnt offering and puts it on Isaac his son. The rabbis there say, using good Roman imagery, like a man required to carry his own cross. Right? He puts the wood on Isaac, and then, and I think this is actually quite striking, Vayikach biyado, he takes in his own hands the fire and the ma'achelet, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, von Rad, great Genesis scholar, says this really stunning thing, intensifying the emotion of this chapter. Why does the text tell us that Abraham holds in his own hand the fire and the knife? Because he cannot allow his son to carry the things that might hurt him. So here, there's this incredible moment of paternal feeling where Abraham says, no, the knife and the torch, I got those. You, my son, you carry the wood. Because those are the things where you could actually hurt yourself. And that, of course, adds to the sort of irony and terror of the story, given what's about to happen. Okay. So now, if we keep going to verse 7, this, I think, fascinating dialogue takes place. Vayomer Yitzchak el Avraham, and Yitzchak said to Avraham, and by the way, notice here, twice, in a way that's clunky, the word Aviv, right? Vayomer Yitzchak el Avraham Aviv, Vayomer Avi, his father, my father, as if to re-emphasize the familial intimacy. And then comes this astonishing moment where Isaac actually gathers the courage to ask, wait a second, let me translate Isaac's question. What's going on here? Where's the actual sacrifice? By the way, the Netziv, the great traditional Bible commentator of the 20th century, who has an incredible, what his commentary is marked by is a kind of incredible psychological astuteness. He actually says, why is it necessary to have this moment of Isaac saying, Avi, and then Abraham saying, Hineni b'ni, and then Isaac asking his question? So the Netziv says, Isaac is so afraid that he can't ask a question that is so utterly vulnerability-inducing without first hearing that his father still knows he's his son. So he says, Dad. And only when his father says, I'm here for you, my son. Hineni as a language of responsiveness, right? Only then can Isaac allow himself to say, Dad, what's going on here? But until that moment of Avraham saying, Hineni v'ni, Yitzchak cannot allow himself to be vulnerable enough to say, what are you doing? And he asks the question, and this again, the text leaves it to us to do the emotional work here. He asks a very straightforward question, right? Not what's going on here, but where's the animal? And Abraham's answer is fascinating, and a bunch of 20th century commentators say something that is already anticipated by Chazal in Breshit Rabbah, by the rabbis in the most important collection of Midrashim on Breshit. That is, that Abraham's answer can be read in two ways. Abraham says, now I'm in verse 8, Elohim yir'elo haseh le'olah b'ni, reading number 1, God will see to his own sheep, my son, or, as Everett Fox and others suggest, Elohim yir'elo haseh le'olah and dash b'ni. Right? God will see to his own sheep, my son. And that literarily, not to mention psychologically, only ups the anxiety. That is, the ambiguity of that verse ups Isaac's anxiety and Abraham's, whatever Abraham is feeling in that moment. Right? The rabbis sort of love this linguistic play because it allows them to say, well, God will see to his own sheep, and if he doesn't, le'olah b'ni. That's why, by the way, I would suggest that if you look further on in this text, it's actually kind of amazing. If you look at verse 13 at the end, this is kind of, I think, amazing. What it says that Abraham does, vayikach et ha'ayil, vaya'aleu le'olah tachat beno. That is olah tachat beno and not olah b'ni. Right? The tachat there does the work of saying, no, instead of you, not you. but it's clearly an allusion back to the ambiguity of Ola Beni. In other words, the ambiguity is, maybe you will be the sacrifice. And the resolution is an animal instead of you. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Ola tachat beno. Okay. Questions or comments as where we are now in this text? Yeah, David.
It would seem that if Isaac is scared, it's a bit premature. They're walking together, and one wonders where the sheep is. There's every possibility that, in fact, the sheep will be found. Yet, when the time to really be scared, when his father is tying him up, there's no indication of fear at all.
Right. So I think that's a really interesting question. I think that what the rabbinic tradition would want to do with that is to suggest that as Isaac comes to understand what's going on, his resolve develops to participate fully. And there, for the rabbis, very consistently, the question of who is being tested here, Abraham or Isaac, the answer there is yes. Right? Very consistently. Right? Isaac is in fact, and in fact we'll see this image later, that Isaac will turn, in a variety of midrashim, will turn to Abraham and say, make sure you tie me up good so that I'm really a pure sacrifice, beli moon. Right?
There's no indication of that at all in the text, that Isaac has anything to do with it. He seems the most passive, unaffected. Except one very important thing, which is in the traditional reading of this text, Isaac is an adult. And actually one of the things that's sort of interesting about this text and ambiguity that runs through it is, on the one hand, if I gave you this chapter alone, you would be inclined to think of Isaac as how old? 5, 10, 12, whatever it is you say, right? According to the rabbinic tradition, he's 37. Which, by the way, makes a tremendous hero out of him. Right? Because, as the Midrash points out quite explicitly, Abraham can't tie up a 37-year-old when he's 100 and whatever, unless the 37-year-old basically says, help me. You know what it's like? Forgive me for this image. It's like when you first realize that when professional wrestlers body slam each other, that they can't do that unless the guy who's being body slammed jumps up and wants to be held that way. Right? You can't lift someone like that otherwise. Right? Now, this is the first time that the World Wrestling Federation and the Akedah have been read in the same passage. But the consequence of that, the consequence of reading Isaac as an adult, which is based on the biblical chronology, is that Isaac becomes a full participant. But you're right, there is a kind of psychological development in this passage. By the time we get to the sacrifice, we no longer see resistance on Isaac's part. Yeah?
Just realize that the meaning of the sacrifice is very different depending on Isaac's age. If Isaac is a very young child, then there's something much more wrenching, I feel like, for Abraham sacrificing his young child who has his whole life ahead of him. But if his son is 37, especially in this time, he has most of his life behind him, and he's a full-grown adult, and it's not the same ramification. It's still very tragic.
So you know what I would say here? I think a lot depends on the cultural context of the reader. Because there are many cultural contexts. For example, the Rambam says something in discussing circumcision that as a new father I find unfathomable. Right? The Rambam says that until a child is a few years old, the parents don't fully love that child in a fully developed way. By the way, I think the reason for that is how many babies die before the modern period, right? The Rambam is talking about a certain kind of naturally, culturally laden hesitation about, let's go back to that language, radical attachment. Whereas I could imagine that other places where someone wanted to say, well, wait a second, right? The opposite. In other words, either the infant is so vulnerable that that's the most painful death possible, or a full-grown adult who's already become a person I relate to, not just my child, but also my friend, right? That's much worse. And a lot will depend on where the reader is standing. What's unique in certain ways about modernity is our awareness of how culturally conditioned our response to that is. Right? I don't think the Rambam had any real awareness of that. Yes, last comment and we'll push forward.
I'm struck by a prosaical issue which I think underlies some of this, which is why is he bringing wood with him? You would think he would be able to get wood along the way, and part of that I think relates to possibly him challenging God, like, I'm going to make sure that this sacrifice is going to occur. But then why does he think that Yitzchak will be satisfied with his answer? If he's bringing the wood, and Yitzchak knows he could get wood along the way, why would he not think he could get wood there and the aisle there? So I don't understand Abraham's thinking of why he...
That, by the way, I think it may be the text response to David Stone's question, which is, wait, yeah, he could get the sheep somewhere else, but he also could have gotten the wood somewhere else, presumably too. So the fact that he's taken everything he needs but the sacrifice is question-begging. Now, by the way, to play up the issue of Isaac's fear, I just want to point out to you something that's, I think, kind of interesting, which is that what does Isaac say to his father? Isaac says in verse 7, Hinei ha'esh v'ha'etzim v'ayeh haseh le'olah. Isaac doesn't mention any knife at all. It's almost like he can't bring himself to say it. Hinei ha'esh v'ha'etzim. Here is the torch and the wood. Isaac, that's not what's going to get you here, right? It's a ma'achelet. Now, a ma'achelet, by the way, is a fascinating word, and I'll take a minute to detour back on that for a second. Ma'achelet, Spicer, the great Christian Bible scholar, suggested that ma'achelet is best translated in English as cleaver. That it's a much stronger word, a much more terrifying word than knife. In other words, cherev doesn't do the work of ma'achelet. By the way, part of that is because ma'achelet almost describes what it does. It's a horrific word. It is that which consumes that which it comes into contact with. Right? I want to point out something to you literally. Now, here is a dilemma in the world of reading texts incredibly closely literarily. And that is how and whether you draw the line between close intertextual literary readings and overreading, right? But I want to point out to you that the phrase "vayikach et ha'ma'achelet," which will appear in verse 10, "vayikach et ha'ma'achelet" appears in only one other place in Tanakh, and that is in the story of Pilegesh Begiv'ah in Judges 19, as he is about to cut up the raped concubine. And I don't know what this means, to be honest. I don't know if it means anything other than what's called in pretentious academies lexical distribution, right? The word just happens to come up there. But I wonder whether Judges 19 is making some comment about Genesis 22 and the innocent status of Isaac as victim too. I don't know. I'm just sort of putting that out there because intertextual associations should never be dismissed so lightly, especially when they appear twice in all of Tanakh. And by the way, the third time the word ma'achelet appears in Tanakh, in Sefer Mishlei, specifically talks about ma'achalot used to attack the vulnerable and the needy. So if we read those three verses together, it's an interesting, let's put it this way. At minimum, we could do some really interesting midrash. At maximum, we could do some interesting literary analysis of what these texts themselves are up to. Okay, so going back for a second, just a bit before we finish. So we're in verses 7 and 8. That again, just to finish that dialogue between Abraham and Isaac, Beno Yaakov, the great Reform Bible scholar, says something that I think is actually kind of fascinating, that it's striking to notice, although I don't know if anyone else but he noticed it until he noticed it, that the dialogue begins with the word avi, and ends with the word bini. That is, that the dialogue is all about asserting and reasserting the intimate familial relationship between Abraham and Isaac, which makes what's about to unfold even more scary, disturbing, horrific. I mean, fill in whatever word works for you. But when you begin a dialogue that's all of a few words long, and it begins with my father, and it ends with my son, there is a kind of suggestiveness to that I think should probably not be overlooked. Now, what I alluded to before, and I want to just develop for a minute here, is I actually think that one of the things that is going on when Abraham says, Elohim yir'elo hasela olah b'ni, God will see to his own sheep, my son, is that in this moment, Abraham is beginning in a subtle way to turn the test a little bit on God. God, will you or won't you? Or let me put it a little differently. In verse 2, God appears in all God's inscrutability. Right? The absolute inscrutability of the divine will. The majestic God who demands what he wants. Going back to your comment from earlier. And in verse 8, what does Abraham do? He says, you know, one pole of a theology is inscrutability, but the other pole is a certain kind of reliability. And so in the face of divine inscrutability, I'm going to affirm divine reliability. Elohim yir'elo hasel olam. And the text, I think, takes that very seriously because what does it say in verse 14? This is, I think, amazing. Text says in verse 14 that Abraham calls this place Hashem Yir'eh. In fact, what does verse 14 say? Abraham says, it's not just I who passed the test, it's God too. Hashem Yir'eh. I said, Hashem Yir'elo. Elohim Yir'elo. Hasel Olah B'ni. And then, in fact, God shows up, and it's not a seh, but it's an ayil, whatever, we'll leave that for now, a ram. And Abraham essentially says, yeah, see, I told you God would see to it. God did see. So actually, there is sort of this mutual testing going on. Abraham is tested, and one of the only ways he can cope with the test is at least as a piece of it to turn the test on God. And that's verse 8. And it's implied in verse 5. Right? Nishtachaveh v'nashuva aleichem. It's developed a little in verse 8. And then it's brought to resolution in verse 14 where Abraham says, Hashem Yir'eh. I was right. It's okay to have faith. And in fact, it may be worth thinking about, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit next time, this text as playing with the ways the biblical God is at once inscrutable and reliable. And the moving back and forth between those two poles in the theology. The God who can't be understood and the God who can fundamentally be relied on. Another way of putting that, and I sort of throw this out as a kind of, a little bit of a heavy point to put out, but I think it's worth at least sitting with a little bit, and that is, if this text is about one thing, no, I'm going to put this differently. This text is about many things. One of the things this text is, I think, very clearly about, from our later perspective, is the ways in which the God of the Bible cannot so easily be reconciled with the God of philosophy. That is to say, in the language of Walter Brueggemann, one of the great Christian Bible scholars of our time, the God of the Hebrew Bible is not a logical premise. Right? The God of the Hebrew Bible has a personality and a will. And one of the things that is most true about the God of the Hebrew Bible is that God acts in ways that are surprising. God is an unsettling God. Right? The God of Aristotle does not fall in love. The God of Genesis 12 does. And onward, right? Nor does the God of Aristotle feel hurt or angered or regretful. I'm making a point that's actually quite obvious, although in the history of Judaism it was not obvious to the Rambam, right? And with perhaps you could say with good reason, right? The attempt to synthesize those two worldviews, what I called in something I wrote, scriptural covenantal monotheism on the other, and abstract philosophical monotheism, right? Those two kinds of monotheism. Even using the word monotheism about the Hebrew Bible is a kind of philosophical importation. But there's a tension here. And this story is about a God who's unpredictable. Right? And that needs to be grappled with if the theology is to be biblical rather than merely taking the sting out of the Bible consistently. See Book 1 of the God That Perplexed. Right? Which is an incredibly powerful exercise in Midrash of suggesting that every display of divine emotion, let's say, is in fact not what it appears to be. But it's hard to read that here. Okay, so pushing a little bit further in this text.
Sean,
yeah, please.
At some point, you could comment on Greek gods in terms of that whole last thing you said about predictability and inscrutability and whim. Because, I mean, if that's a measure.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a big conversation that I just sort of irresponsibly put out, and then I'm going to walk away from. Look, I think that if you asked this text whether God's primary characteristic was caprice or whimsy, I think the answer would be no. Absolutely not. God is in this sort of, I think, dialectical relationship between being God and therefore having the sovereign capacity to choose what God wants, but also being covenanted and therefore obligated to a certain kind of relationality and decency. And we'll see, actually, I don't know if we're going to get to it today, I hope we will, we'll see a passage in Reshit Rabbah where God says to Abraham, had I actually had you kill Isaac, I would have violated the covenant. I mean, you know, right? I mean, in other words, and what's implicit there is the rabbi's passionate insistence that God, too, is bound by the terms of God's covenant. In other words, God, in entering into a relationship, sets a limit on the right of inscrutability. I don't know if that formulation makes sense to people, but that's part of what God does. By entering into a relationship. Now, if you want to be a theologian outside of the Bible and talk about the experience of the Jews through history, that's a different conversation. But in the Bible, entering into covenant on some level reigns God's pure ability to do whatever God wants on some level. Because God makes certain commitments to behave in certain ways. And in fact, it's a major theme in rabbinic literature that God is unlike earthly kings. In that, this is kind of paradoxical and counterintuitive in certain ways. An earthly king very often sets laws and says, I'm not bound by them. But God says, I set laws and I am bound by them. That's the covenantal understanding of God in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, that's a lot of stuff to sort of talk about and think about. Maybe we'll have chances to come to it further as we go. Now, just sort of quickly coming to near the end of this text, when the angel says in verse 12, Ataya dati, it occurs to me, it's sort of interesting that that phrase, now I know that you fear God, that phrase, Ataya dati, when it appears in other places in the Tanakh, is about human beings discovering the faithfulness of God. So think, for example, from the daily prayers of Psalm 20, verse 7, Ataya dati ki Hoshia Hashem ishicho. Now I know that the God is faithful. Or, in this week's Parsha, Yitro says, Ki badavar asher zadu alehem, whatever that means, which is, in the inimitable JPS translation, meaning of Heb uncertain. Right? Whatever that means. But now I know that God is the powerful and faithful God. So I wonder whether, interestingly, when we hear the words here of God saying, the angel saying, Ataya dati, that you, Abraham, are faithful to me, whether that's supposed to have a certain kind of covenantal ring to it, which is, oh yeah, usually that phrase means, oh, now I, the human being, know that you, God, can be relied upon. But this text is about, or at least in this, if I'm not overreading here, right, God discovering that Abraham is trustworthy. Actually, what I would suggest, for whatever it's worth, is that one of the things going on in this text, the meaning of Abraham turning the test on God, is that this text is about each of them discovering the trustworthiness of the other. Right? God learns that he can ask Abraham whatever he wants, and Abraham learns that he won't. Or that in the end, God will not do this to him. Elohim yir'elo hasela olah, as a kind of theological revelation on Abraham's part, or Hashem yir'eh, right? No, it is true. I am naming this place the place of God being faithful, which, by the way, makes even more powerful the rabbinic insistence that this is the place of the Beit HaMikdash. Right? This is the place of divine faithfulness. So it's not just, and here I really want to sort of hammer home this point, it's not just, as we're usually inclined to say, that the Jewish people can appeal to Abraham's faithfulness in this place, but also that the Jewish people can be confident of God's faithfulness in this place. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Right? That, in other words, both aspects of that faithfulness become central to what is the Beit HaMikdash, the place where God and humanity are reconciled. And reconciliation depends on a certain kind of faithfulness to relationship. Yes, please.
So this talk about like God's caprice and whim versus, God's covenantal obligations, like a lot of the stories reminding me of Job, right? Where God also tests Job's faith and,
right.
Does take everything away. Doesn't just threaten, but actually takes everything away and then restores it later.
So next week we're going to talk about Abraham and Job.
Okay.
It's a great question and it's I think really not coincidental that the rabbis in exploring this story of Genesis 22 will use language that is reminiscent of Iyov. We'll talk about Hashem Tzadik Yivchan in the language of the Psalms, and in Job, it's actually the language is Bachan and not Nisa. So there's a lot of sort of textual links there. We will, I hope, spend at least a few minutes exploring that. I'm not trying to cut off your question, but rather give it more time next time. David and then Ben, and then we'll move forward.
When the order is given to sacrifice Isaac, it's given by God himself. When the order is given to stop at the very last second, it's given by an angel. Why is it not given by God? How does Abraham know that it's truly the will of God? What authority, how does he know that the angel has some authority?
Ladies and gentlemen, an attorney at law. Yeah, keep going.
And the last time when the covenant, the promise is given, the angel is sufficiently insecure of his own authority that he says, I swear that God says the following. So there's some question about the authority of the angel. And in fact, Abraham is violating God's commandment by relying upon the angel.
By the way, this happens it happens both in 21 and 22, right? That is, in 21:2, it's the angel who appears to Hagar and says, it's okay. Why
This is even more serious. I mean, here he's relying on a third party with no apparent authority.
Heschel says somewhere, it's a really fabulous line, Heschel says somewhere that the real test of a man of faith is not whether he will listen to God's command to kill, but to an angel's command not to. Now, I don't know exactly what... the answer to that question is, I'm still working on it. Meaning I'm still trying to figure out exactly what's going on there. I think it appears in both places. It seems like, for some... I don't have a good... Put it this way, I don't have a theologically interesting answer other than this sort of interesting piece of the angel doing the work of withdrawing or countermanding the original divine command. I'm not sure what to do with it. When I was younger, and I was tempted to read the Akedah as a story of God's failure, of Abraham's failure, which I think in the end, as I've come to read texts more closely, is not a sustainable reading of the text, although I understand why some might want to do that work theologically. I was tempted to say that the reason why it's an angel here is that God can't bring himself to actually speak to Abraham anymore because he's a little horrified by what just happened. Right? On the one hand, he wanted it. On the other hand, he's sort of like, what? Now, I have to say, I think that's like a nice midrash to try and make a reading of Abraham's failure work. I don't think that's what's going on in this text. By the way, if you want to do that even further, here's another bad reading of this text, but a nice kind of piece of evidence. What does God say? The angel say, now I know that you were a fearer of God. Right? And if you were a lover of God, maybe you would have told me no. Now, I don't think that's a good reading of the text. I think it's like a nice, again, it's if you want to kind of brush up against this text really hard, you can play with those pieces. But I don't think it works. So this is an incredibly long-winded way of saying, I don't know. I'm working on it. I'm thinking about it. John? Oh, sorry, Ben, and then I really want to push forward because it's 8:46 and we're in part 1 of 3. This is not good. Yes?
Do you have anything to say about the use of Elohim and Hashem interchangeably?
I do not know how to answer that question without entering into a rather heated debate among source critics about the sources of this story. Although I think actually one of the things that's clear is even if you do that kind of thing, Elohim and Hashem are still used interchangeably by whichever source might be doing this work. Some people have recently suggested, I mean, not to sort of cause anyone deep theological damage, but that the original narrative here is verse 1 to 11, I'm sorry, verse 1 to 10, followed by verse 15. By the way, I just want to say, before you do this, that I think this is a really unconvincing reading, but it's out there in the world of biblical scholarship. That is, verses 1 to 10. 10 ends with Abraham raising his knife, his cleaver, to slaughter his son. And verse 15 and 16 say, Yan asher asita tadavar hazeh. V'lo chasachta et bincha et yichidecha. You did it. Now I know that you fear God. And that would explain why in verse 19 it says, Abraham went back to the servants. Where is Isaac? According to this reading, Isaac is dead. That would also make sense. That would also make sense of why we have this rabbinic tradition of talking about afaro shel Yitzchak tzavur al hamizbeach, right? The ashes of Isaac that are on the altar. Hello, he walked away, right? Now, this is a good example of sort of source criticism drama without any textual support that I can find. And I mean, if you really want to do this, it actually depends on thinking that E doesn't know anything about Jacob being the son of Isaac. Jacob is some. All of this is a wild hypothesis with no textual support whatsoever, right? It's just a wild hypothesis. And also, it depends on assuming that the second angelic speech is primary, and the first angelic speech is an interjection to clean up the mess and say, no, don't do it. But any literary scholar who's read this has come to the conclusion that the second angelic passage is a kind of play on the first angelic passage. So this is another long-winded way of saying, I don't think you should make too much of the Hashem Elohim thing in this passage. And I don't think that particularly source-critical reading, which has been put forward, if I'm not mistaken, by Richard Elliott Friedman, and more recently by other younger scholars, to use the language of medieval rabbinic figures when they have just finished dismantling an argument and then wanting to say nicely that they don't agree, lo nireli, right? I don't find this very convincing. I think it's like a fun game, but yeah, it requires a lot without any textual support. John, you want to say something, and then I'm going to push forward.
Maybe it's a terribly obvious point, but where it says Ki Yireh Elohim Atah, which is easily translated as you're a fearer of God, the use of the word fear there is a little bit troubling to me, because in a simple sense, if somebody other than God tells you to kill someone, to kill your son, he could, if he was simply afraid, he would have let himself die. He would have put himself there instead of his son. So it's not simple fear. I mean, we translate it as fear. The question is, what is it? The translation fear is very unsatisfying.
Yeah, although
maybe the only one we have, but
right. So it's interesting. It is the case, I think, that in biblical Hebrew, Yireh Elohim probably means a willingness to obey the divine command more than it means an emotional affect of fear. Now I know that you are
cooperative.
Yeah, something like that, right?
I mean, that cheapens it.
No, it does. It does. I mean, and of course, look, we if you want to have fun sometime, the fact that I just started the sentence that way says something very disturbing about me, but if you want to have fun sometime, sort of play philologically with the root of words like yirah, ahava, and what they might mean in biblical Hebrew, and how they sort of shade between emotions and sort of commitments to actions in particular ways. That's what makes them, in some ways, proto-rabbinic words, because they're about the kind of integration of a certain kind of emotional posture and a willingness to act on that posture. But that's another discussion for another time. Now, I have 7 minutes with which I want to sort of actually draw your attention to the striking thing in verse 19 that we've already alluded to, is that Isaac is not described as going back. And this has led the rabbinic tradition to develop an array of sort of fantasies or imaginings of where Yitzchak goes after the Akedah, some of which we will talk about next time when we look at the consequences for Isaac. More recently, by the way, some Bible scholars, sort of trying to spoil our fun, have sort of said, well, this is the way a saga begins. A saga begins with the hero starting out and ends with the hero going home. So the fact that it says, and Abraham returns to his lads, means, yeah, that's what the story's about. Like, don't, as my mother used to say, don't make it simus out of nothing, right? On the other hand, I have to say literarily, it still seems to me to be extremely suggestive that at the end of this story, especially with the emphasis twice on Vayilchu Shnehem Yachdav, that they went together, the fact that it then says, and Abraham went back, is at least an invitation to the reader to wonder. And one of the things we will spend a fair bit of time on next time is actually thinking about biblically where Isaac might have gone, and why. I'm finding it physically painful not to say it now, but I have to try to get you to come back. Now, and then again, finally, just remember this interesting development. And again, since we're focusing on Genesis 22 alone, it's complicated. But this statement of Yan Asher Asita really, in a way, complicates or deepens the terms of the covenant. Because instead of being a moment of, in the language of Christian theology, the emphasis on promise, it becomes an emphasis on relationship. Right? Now Abraham has to, as I said before, has to do something, and by the way, not just something, but a huge thing, in order to merit, or in order to earn the divine blessing. And I think the work that we have to do as theologians who read this text, which we won't do now, is actually to figure out how to take all of these First, it's Abraham, here's a promise. Then it's Abraham, circumcise your son, and if you do that, here's a promise. And then it's kill your son, sacrifice your son. And if you do that, here's a promise. And so you can call this a kind of moment of maturation. Abraham is asked to enter into a relationship. Abraham is asked now in some form to earn, however disturbing, we're bracketing for a minute now, however disturbed we might be by this, but Abraham is asked to earn the blessing in some way. Or we have some kind of delicate dance between, well, wait a second, is divine blessing something earned or an act of grace? And the answer is, it's a kind of really interesting soup between them, right? And that's how theology works. It's kind of both, right? To quote the TV show, will and grace. That's what that, I assume that's where the authors of that show came up with those names. I should be totally serious. You think I'm kidding? I'm being serious. Little did you know that sitcoms are in fact intertextual commentaries on the history of Christian theology. You didn't know that, but now you do. Now, maybe I'll end by pointing out something that I think is interesting for our own context. And then I'm going to ask you to do one of two things. Either the packet of sources from Reshit Rabbah that you got tonight, leave it here or bring it back. But don't take it home and not bring it back, because I would rather do less damage to God's earth than I have to. So either leave it here or bring it back, but don't take it home and put it in your recycling. Or don't take it home and not put it in your recycling. I think it's maybe. Now, what I want to say in closing that I think is interesting, just to think about the location of the reader. is the following, which I think is actually quite amazing. When you read 20th century writers on the Akedah, including very good, careful biblical scholars, you will find them talking about Abraham being commanded to murder his son. And from a 20th century perspective, that is in fact quite understandable. But I think it's actually important in wrestling with a biblical text to know that in the mind of Sefer Breshit, being ordered to sacrifice your son is not the same thing as being ordered to murder him. Now, that may cut against some of our own moral commitments. It may even cut against some of our own sense of what the Hebrew Bible's moral commitments are. But I think it's actually really important in moving back and forth, as I suggest we do, between thinking about this text or thinking with this text on its own terms and thinking about this text on our own terms, to be conscious of the ways this text may not be at all about Abraham being asked to murder his son. And that may be, as John Levinson has suggested, one of the ways. There are many ways, and those of you who were in my class in the fall, we talked about any of these ways. That may be one of the ways to understand why Genesis 18 is so different than Genesis 22. Because Genesis 18 takes place in a forensic context, whereas Genesis 22 takes place in a sacrificial context. Meaning, Genesis 18 is about punishing the wicked. And in that calculus, Abraham speaks up and says, "What are you doing?" But in Genesis 22, which is not a forensic context at all, but a sacrificial context, Abraham says, "Oh, okay." Now, I don't say that to mitigate the horror, nor, and I really want to emphasize this, do I say that to say, as I think sometimes scholars who point this out do, so therefore we should sort of quietly accept this text's own theological assumptions about sacrifice. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting a certain kind of awareness, self-awareness. This goes in a way that's something I said to you in a different context earlier, about being aware of our social, theological, philosophical location and the ways in which that is continuous and discontinuous with the social, theological, and philosophical context of this passage. Now, just to be clear, it is the case that many biblical passages, right, many, if you want we could make a list, are extremely condemnatory of child sacrifice. But there's also the notion that the firstborn does belong to God, right? That remains. I just did a pidyon ben on my son, right? I mean, that remains. And that sort of dialectic is still alive in this text. Again, I'm not saying that so we should go home and feel good about that, but only that we should be kind of aware interpreters of this text. That's something that, for example, Kant, right, totally misses about this text. Or is conscious of, but basically says, I'm not interested. Because the fact is, from my perspective, it's murder. Right? But there's no, in other words, when Kant says Abraham should have said, this is the famous passage in Kant, Abraham should have said, right, that it is forbidden to kill my son, this I know with certainty, and that you have told me to kill him, this I do not know with certainty. Right? Now, what Kant does not point out there, which maybe he ought to, maybe he does not need to, is, right, he's operating in a context in which, as are we all the more so, sacrifice is no longer the most meaningful metaphor for us. In fact, we all kind of get the willies, right? And we get to Sefer Vayikra, and many people who otherwise love to go to shul, right, begin to be all nervous, right? And that is, I think, important to just keep in mind about our own sort of social, intellectual, moral distance from that whole discourse. And to read Genesis well on its own terms, we just need to also be aware that the sacrificial context has its own set of theological and moral assumptions. Now, it is exactly 9 o'clock. In the interest of, I'm not sure what, I'll take one comment. Yes, and then I'm going home. And as are you, I hope.
Just to comment on what you were saying about the sacrificial milieu, that some people see this as a gift to Avram, right? Avram, who is steeped in a society that practiced idolatry and child worship, and might actually have gotten some type of wish fulfillment or satisfaction from having participated in something like that, because that's really what the ethos of the time was.
So yeah, okay. So let me say two quick things to you. One, there is huge scholarly debate now about to what extent child sacrifice was or wasn't prevalent in the ancient Near East. It is no longer actually clearly accepted that it was wildly pervasive. It's an interesting question. And yes, as we'll see, some of the readers, we'll see in week 4 of this class, some of the readers who want to emphasize al tishlach yadchai al anar, right? Don't touch that boy, want to emphasize exactly the point you're making, right? Which may or may not be a good reading of the pshat of this text, but I think is a very important 20th century cultural reading, that is the repudiation of certain kinds of religiously driven horrific behavior, which maybe we'll end with that and continue next time. Thank you very much.